Wander into the woods alone and they'll make sure you don't leave. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. Not the kind whispered around campfires, where shadows dance and every rustle in the bushes is a monster waiting to pounce. Growing up in a small town in upstate New York, I heard plenty of those tales. Old legends about cursed lands, vengeful spirits, and woods that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I'd roll my eyes, laugh it off, and go about my day. But that was before I moved to Ashwood, before I stepped into those woods behind my new house, before I felt the weight of something watching me, something that didn't want me to leave. My name is Ethan Carver, and I'm a 32-year-old freelance photographer. I've always chased solitude, seeking out quiet corners of the world to capture through my lens. Abandoned buildings, forgotten trails, places where time seems to have stopped. After a messy breakup and a string of bad luck in the city, I needed a fresh start. Ashwood seemed perfect. It's a sleepy little town, barely a blip on the map, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place where everyone knows your name within a week, and the nearest Walmart is a 45-minute drive. I found a fixer-upper cabin on the edge of town, cheap enough for my savings, with a sprawling backyard that bled into the woods. The realtor called it rustic charm. I called it home. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, setting up my darkroom and exploring Ashwood's Main Street, a single strip of mom-and-pop shops, a diner, and a bar that smelled like stale beer and regret. The locals were friendly enough, though they had a way of looking at you like they were sizing up how long you'd last. City folk don't stay long, the bartender, a grizzled man named Hank, told me one night over a lukewarm pint. 𝒕𝒉𝒆𝒂𝒓. I laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of unease that stuck with me. The woods behind my cabin were what drew me to the place. They were old, untouched, the kind of forest that feels ancient, like it's been there since the earth was young. Towering pines and gnarled oaks stretched as far as I could see, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was different in there, heavier, thicker, like it carried the weight of secrets. I'd take my camera out at dawn, chasing the light as it filtered through the mist, capturing the way the fog clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. It was peaceful, or so I thought. It started with small things. I'd be out shooting, crouched low to frame a shot of a moss-covered stump, and I'd hear a sound, a twig snapping, a rustle in the underbrush. Normal forest noises, I told myself. Deer, foxes, maybe a bear, but the sounds felt deliberate. Like something was pacing me, just out of sight. I'd turn, scan the trees, and find nothing but shadows. My photos started coming out strange too. Blurry patches where there should have been crisp details. Faint smudges that looked almost like faces when I squinted at them in the darkroom. I blamed my equipment, figured I'd gotten some bad chemicals or a faulty lens. Then there was the tree. I found it about a mile into the woods, a massive oak that stood alone in a small clearing. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, like it had been wrung out by giant hands, and its branches reached out like skeletal fingers. The ground around it was barren, not a blade of grass or a single weed, just packed dirt that felt unnaturally cold underfoot. What caught my eye, though, were the carvings. Deep, jagged marks etched into the bark, symbols I couldn't make sense of, spirals and lines that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. I took a few shots, but when I developed them, the tree was just a blur, like the camera couldn't focus on it. I went back the next day to try again, but the carvings were gone. Not smoothed over or covered up, gone like they'd never been there. That's when I started asking around. I showed some of my blurry photos to Hank at the bar, hoping for an explanation. He took one look, set his rag down, and leaned in close. "You been out to the old oak?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded and his face tightened. "Stay away from it, Ethan. Those woods, they ain't right." Folks go in there alone and sometimes they don't come back. Not the same anyway. He wouldn't say more, just poured me another drink and changed the subject. I pressed a few others in town, a librarian, the guy who ran the hardware store, but they all gave me the same look, part pity, part warning. "Don't wander too far," the librarian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The woods don't like strangers." I tried to shrug it off, but the unease was creeping in. At night, I'd lie awake in my cabin, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Sometimes it sounded like voices, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from just beyond the tree line. I'd tell myself it was my imagination, that I was just spooked by small-town gossip. But then I found the footprints. It was a Sunday morning, gray and damp from an overnight rain. I was out back, sipping coffee on my porch when I noticed them. A trail of bare footprints leading from the edge of the woods to my back door. They were small like a child's, but the toes were too long, too pointed, like they didn't belong to anything human. I followed them to the tree line where they stopped abruptly, like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I checked the door, locked, no signs of tampering, but the sight of those prints sent a chill down my spine. I spent the rest of the day inside, double-checking every lock, my camera sitting untouched on the table. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind was louder than usual, rattling the windows, and those murmurs were back, clearer now, like a chorus of whispers circling the house. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it out the window. The beam caught something, a flash of movement, a pale shape darting between the trees. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer caught in the light. I forced myself back to bed, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until I could almost make out words. Stay, stay, stay. The next morning I found more footprints. This time they circled the house, a perfect ring of those unnatural, childlike tracks. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That I was scared of some barefoot kid playing pranks. Instead, I grabbed my camera and headed back to the oak. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could prove it was all in my head, that the carvings and the footprints were just tricks of the light or my own paranoia. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The woods felt alive, watching, waiting. And as I stepped into the clearing, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, and I swear I saw something move in the shadows, just out of sight, just beyond my lens. The clearing around the old oak felt like a different world. The air was thick, pressing against my skin, and the whispers I'd heard all night seemed to hum in the ground beneath my feet. I stood there, camera in hand, staring at the tree. Its gnarled trunk loomed larger than I remembered, its branches curling toward the sky like they were reaching for something or someone. The barren patch of dirt around it was unchanged, still eerily lifeless, but the carvings I'd seen before were nowhere to be found. I circled the tree, running my fingers over the rough bark, searching for any trace of those strange symbols. Nothing. Just smooth, unmarred wood, as if the forest itself had erased them. I raised my camera, determined to get a clear shot this time. The viewfinder framed the oak perfectly, its twisted form filling the lens. But as I pressed the shutter, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing. Not a twig snapping, but something louder, like a bone breaking. I froze, my finger still on the button.
Record it.
The sound came again, from somewhere deeper in the woods, followed by a low, guttural hum that vibrated in my chest. I lowered the camera, scanning the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, not with the wind, but with purpose, like they were closing in. I told myself to stay calm. I'd been in forests before, spent hours alone in the wild chasing photos. This was just my mind playing tricks, amplified by Hank's cryptic warnings and those damn footprints. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a glint of white in the underbrush, just beyond the clearing. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, pushing aside ferns and brambles. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small, cracked bone. It looked old, weathered, but it wasn't an animal's. The shape was wrong, too delicate, too human. A finger bone, maybe, or part of a wrist. My stomach churned as I crouched down, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Instead, I snapped a quick photo, the flash cutting through the dim light. As the shutter clicked, the whispers surged, a chorus of voices now, overlapping and urgent. Stay, stay. Don't leave. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my camera, and that's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the trees. Something pale, low to the ground, darting between the trunks. It was fast, too fast, and gone before I could focus. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to stay put. Running would only make it worse, whatever it was. I backed away from the bone, keeping my eyes on the trees, and made my way to the clearing's edge. The whispers followed me, not louder but closer, like they were breathing down my neck. When I reached the path back to my cabin, I noticed something new, more footprints. Not the childlike ones from before, but larger, heavier, with deep impressions that suggested weight. They didn't lead toward the clearing. They led away toward my house. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen these on my way in, and I would have noticed. Someone, or something, had been here while I was at the oak. I don't remember much of the walk back. My legs moved on autopilot, my flashlight sweeping the path ahead, every rustle in the bushes spiking my adrenaline. When I reached the cabin, the footprints stopped at my back door again, but this time, there was something else. Scratched into the wooden frame, barely visible in the fading daylight, were the same symbols I'd seen on the oak. Spirals, jagged lines, shapes that made my eyes ache when I stared too long. I took a photo, then another, my hands shaking so badly the camera barely stayed steady. I didn't go inside right away. I couldn't. Instead, I sat on the porch, staring at the tree line, waiting for something to emerge. Nothing did, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, I developed the photos in my darkroom, a cramped shed I'd converted behind the cabin. The process usually calmed me. Watching images emerge in the chemical bath was like magic, a ritual that grounded me, but not this time. The photo of the oak was another blur just like before, but the bone came out clear, stark white against the dark earth. Too clear. In the negative, I could see details I hadn't noticed in person. Faint scratches on the bone like tiny claw marks, and something else in the background. A smudge that looked like a face, eyeless and gaping, hovering just above the ground. I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the photos spread out in front of me, trying to make sense of it. The whispers were quieter now, but they hadn't stopped. They came through the walls, seeping in from the woods, a constant hum that made my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m., I heard a new sound, a soft thump like something heavy landing on the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and a kitchen knife, though I had no idea what good it would do. I stepped outside, shining the beam upward, but saw nothing. Just the slanted roof of my cabin, slick with dew. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement at the edge of the woods. That pale shape again, low and quick, vanishing before I could track it. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a bookshelf in front of it. It wouldn't stop whatever was out there, but it made me feel marginally safer. I spent the rest of the night going through my photos, looking for clues. One image from a week earlier caught my attention. It was a shot of the woods at dusk, nothing special, just trees and shadows. But in the corner, barely visible, was a figure. Not clear enough to make out details, but tall, thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. I hadn't seen it when I took the photo, and I hadn't noticed it when I developed it. But there it was, staring back at me. The next morning, I went to the library. Ashwood's library was a small, musty building with flickering fluorescent lights and shelves crammed with books older than my parents. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, was the one who'd warned me about the woods. She was in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I showed her the photos, the bone, the blurry oak, the figure in the shadows. Her face paled as she flipped through them, her fingers lingering on the bone. "Where'd you find this?" she asked, her voice tight. "In the woods near the old oak," I said. "Do you know what's going on?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a thick, leather-bound book from a locked cabinet behind her desk. It was a history of Ashwood, written by some local scholar in the 1920s. She flipped to a section marked The Hollow. "These woods," she said, tapping the page, "they've always been strange. People used to say the land was cursed, that something lived here before the town was built. Something old. They called it the Hollow's Keeper." I skimmed the page. It talked about disappearances, hunters, loggers, kids who wandered too far and never came back. Some were found days later, alive but changed, babbling about voices and shadows. Others were never seen again, except for bones, scattered like offerings. The book mentioned the oak too, calling it the heart of the hollow, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. I felt a chill, remembering the whispers, the footprints, the face in my photo. Mrs. Hargrove closed the book. "If you're smart, Ethan, you'll pack up and leave. The woods don't let go easy." I wanted to argue, to tell her I wasn't afraid of old stories, but the weight of her words and the photos in my hand made it hard to dismiss. As I left the library, the whispers followed me, faint but persistent, like they were calling me back to the trees. I didn't pack up and leave. Maybe I should have, but something kept me rooted to Ashwood, curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe the woods themselves, tugging at me like an invisible thread. The whispers were constant now, a low hum that followed me everywhere, even into town. I'd catch snippets of words in the rustle of leaves or the creak of my cabin's floorboards. Stay, watch, hours. I tried to ignore them, but they burrowed into my thoughts, making it hard to focus on anything else. My camera, once my lifeline, felt like a weight around my neck. Every photo I developed now had something wrong: smudges, shadows, shapes that shouldn't be there. I stopped taking pictures, but the woods didn't stop calling. I started spending more time at the library, digging through that old book Mrs. Hargrove had shown me. It was dense, written in a dry, academic tone, but the details were chilling. The Hollow, as the locals called the woods, had a history stretching back centuries. Before Ashwood was settled in the 1800s, the land belonged to a small Native American tribe who avoided the area, claiming it was touched by the Old Ones. The book didn't elaborate on who or what the Old Ones were, but it described rituals, offerings of blood and bone left at the base of the old oak to appease whatever lived in the forest. When settlers arrived, they ignored the warnings, built their homes, and started disappearing. The disappearances weren't random. The book listed names, dates, patterns. Hunters who ventured too deep, children who strayed from the path, even entire families who vanished without a trace. Some were found days or weeks later, wandering the woods in a daze, unable to explain where they'd been. Others left only fragments, bones like the one I'd found, scattered in clearings or buried in shallow graves. The book mentioned the carvings too, describing them as marks of the keeper, symbols that appeared and vanished without explanation. Reading it felt like piecing together a puzzle, but the picture it formed was one I didn't want to see. I started noticing things in town too. The way people avoided talking about the woods, changing the subject with forced smiles. The way they watched me when they thought I wasn't looking, like they were waiting for something to happen. Hank at the bar was the worst. He'd pour my drinks in silence, his eyes flicking to the windows whenever the wind picked up. One night I pushed him. "What's the deal with the woods, Hank? What's everyone so afraid of?" He didn't answer right away, just wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. Finally, he said, "Some things you don't question, Ethan, you just stay away." But I couldn't stay away. The woods were in my head, in my dreams. Every night I'd see the oak, its branches twisting into shapes that looked like faces, mouths open in silent screams. I'd wake up sweating, the whispers echoing in my ears. One night, I found myself standing at my back door barefoot, my hand on the knob with no memory of getting out of bed. The footprints were back, those strange, childlike ones, now mixed with the larger, heavier tracks. They didn't just circle the house anymore. They led inside, stopping at the edge of my darkroom. I tore the place apart, looking for any sign of an intruder. Nothing was missing, nothing was touched, but the air felt wrong, like someone had been there standing over me while I slept. I started sleeping with the knife under my pillow, though I knew it was useless. Whatever was out there wasn't human, or if it was, it didn't play by the rules of flesh and blood. I stopped going into the woods, but that didn't stop the woods from coming to me. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, sometimes forming full sentences. "Come back. You belong here." I went back to Mrs. Hargrove, desperate for answers. She was reluctant, but I showed her the new photos, more blurry shots of the oak, more smudges that looked like faces. She sighed, her hands trembling as she pulled another book from the locked cabinet. This one wasn't a history, it was a journal handwritten, dated 1893 by a man named Elias Ward. He'd been a pastor in Ashwood, one of the first settlers, and his entries were frantic, disjointed. He wrote about the hollow, about the keeper, a being he described as neither man nor beast, but something older, hungrier. He claimed it lived in the oak, that the tree was a gateway, and that the carvings were its language, a way of marking its territory. Elias's last entry was dated the day he disappeared. It was just one line. "I went to the oak and it saw me." The journal ended there, but Mrs. Hargrove filled in the rest. Elias's body was never found, only his Bible left at the base of the oak, its pages covered in those same strange symbols. "The keeper doesn't let go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once it notices you, it doesn't stop." I left the library feeling like I'd swallowed glass. The journal, the footprints, the whispers, it was all too much. I decided to leave Ashwood. I'd pack my things, sell the cabin, and get as far from those woods as I could. But when I got home, my plans unraveled. The back door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, my darkroom was in chaos. Photos torn from the walls, chemicals spilled across the floor. In the center of the mess on my work table was a single bone, identical to the one I'd found in the woods. Scratched into its surface were the symbols, fresh and deep, like they'd been carved with a knife. I didn't touch it. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and a change of clothes, intending to drive straight out of town. But as I stepped outside, I saw it, the pale shape standing at the edge of the woods. It was taller this time, humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. The whispers surged, a deafening chorus now. "Stay, stay, you're ours." I ran to my car, fumbled with the keys, and peeled out of the driveway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I made it to the edge of town before I realized I wasn't alone. In the rearview mirror I saw it, the figure, loping along the road behind me, keeping pace with my car. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I floored the gas, the engine roaring, but it didn't fall behind. It was closer now, its face still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into the back of my skull. The whispers were inside the car now, inside my head, drowning out everything else. I don't know how long I drove. The road out of Ashwood is a winding one, flanked by trees that seemed to lean in, their branches scraping the roof of my car. The figure kept pace, always just behind, never close enough to see clearly. Finally, the road opened up and I hit the highway, the lights of Ashwood fading in the distance. The figure was gone, the whispers quieted, but I didn't feel safe. I stopped at a gas station an hour later, my hands still shaking as I filled the tank. When I went to pay, the clerk, an older man with tired eyes, glanced at my license plate. "You from Ashwood?" he asked. I nodded and he shook his head. "Folks don't leave that place easy. Something always follows." I didn't sleep that night. I checked into a motel, locked the door and sat up with the lights on, waiting for the whispers to start again. They didn't, but the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, like the woods were biding their time. I kept my camera close, though I hadn't touched it since the darkroom. When I finally worked up the courage to check the photos, I found one I didn't remember taking. It was of the oak, clear for the first time, its carvings glowing faintly in the dark. And in the foreground, just at the edge of the frame, was the figure, tall, pale, its face a void, staring straight at the lens. The motel room smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, but it was the only place I could afford after fleeing Ashwood. I sat on the sagging bed, the photo of the oak and that faceless figure clutched in my hands. The image was impossibly clear, unlike any I'd taken before. The carvings on the tree seemed to pulse, their spirals and jagged lines almost moving on the glossy paper. The figure, though, its blank, eyeless face, was what kept me awake, staring at the locked door, expecting it to burst open any second. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was heavier, like the air before a lightning strike. I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I'd seen in the woods, whatever had followed me, wasn't done with me. I didn't dare develop any more photos. My camera sat on the nightstand, its lens cap on, like sealing it shut could keep the thing in the pictures at bay. But I couldn't stop looking at the one I held. The figure's posture was wrong, too still, too angular, like it wasn't bound by the same physics as the rest of the world. Its head was tilted, not in curiosity but in something closer to hunger. I kept thinking about the gas station clerk's words, "Something always follows." Had it followed me here, to this dingy motel off a lonely highway? I checked the window every few minutes, pulling back the curtain to scan the parking lot. Nothing but my car and a flickering streetlight, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. By morning I was a wreck, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from too much coffee and no sleep. I needed answers, not just about the figure but about what the woods wanted from me. I couldn't go back to Ashwood, not yet, but I remembered Mrs. Hargrove mentioning a name from the journal, Elias Ward, the pastor who'd vanished in 1893. If anyone had left a trail, it would be him. I drove to the nearest town with a decent library, a place called Millhaven, about 30 miles away. It was bigger than Ashwood, with a proper archive section, and I hoped it held something, anything, that could explain what I was dealing with. The Millhaven Library was a stark contrast to Ashwood's. It was modern, well-lit, with rows of computers and a climate-controlled archive room. The archivist, a young woman named Clara, was skeptical when I told her I was researching local history, but she humored me, pulling records from the late 19th century. I didn't show her the photo. I wasn't ready to explain that, but I asked about Elias Ward and the hollow. Her expression changed, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "You're from Ashwood, aren't you?" she said, not really a question. I nodded and she sighed, leading me to a box of unsorted documents labeled Regional Folklore. The box was a gold mine and a nightmare. There were newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, even a few grainy photographs from the 1800s. Elias Ward's name came up repeatedly. He'd been a firebrand preacher, obsessed with cleansing the hollow of its supposed evil. His letters described visions, dreams of a tall, pale figure that spoke in whispers, promising eternal life if he surrendered to the woods. He called it the Keeper, just like Mrs. Hargrove had said, but his descriptions were more vivid. It wears no face, yet sees all. It moves without steps, yet follows. One letter, written to a colleague in Boston, begged for help. "The oak is its altar, the hollow its domain. I fear I have looked too long and it knows my name." The final piece was a photograph, yellowed and brittle, showing a group of settlers standing in a clearing. In the center was the oak, unmistakable even in the faded image. The carvings were there, etched into the bark, and in the background, barely visible, was a shape, a tall, thin figure with no face. I felt my stomach drop. It was the same as in my photo, down to the unnatural tilt of its head. Clara noticed my reaction and leaned over. "That's the Ward photo," she said. "Taken a week before he disappeared. Nobody knows who the figure is. Some say it's a trick of the light, but—" She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the image. I left the library with copies of the documents and a growing sense of dread. The drive back to the motel was a blur, my mind racing with what I'd read. Elias Ward had seen the same thing I had, felt the same pull, heard the same whispers, and he was gone. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure loping behind me again. It wasn't there, but the woods were everywhere, lining the highway, stretching into the distance, their dark canopy swallowing the horizon. I realized then that I hadn't escaped Ashwood. The hollow wasn't just a place, it was a presence, and it had marked me. Back at the motel, I spread the documents across the bed, trying to piece it together. Elias's letters mentioned rituals, sacrifices to appease the keeper. The settlers had tried to burn the oak once in 1885, but the fire wouldn't take. The tree stood untouched while the surrounding forest burned. Another account from a hunter in 1902 described finding bones arranged in patterns around the oak, each marked with the same symbols I'd seen. He'd fled, but not before hearing the whispers, "Stay, you're ours." The pattern was clear. Those who got too close to the oak, who saw too much, didn't leave the hollow. Not really. I was starting to understand why the locals in Ashwood were so cagey. They knew. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to stay clear of the woods. I thought about Hank, Mrs. Hargrove, the way they'd looked at me, like I was already lost. I wanted to believe I could still walk away, start over somewhere new, but the photo on the nightstand told a different story. The figure's blank face seemed to stare through me, its presence a promise. You can't run. That night, the whispers came back. They started soft, barely audible over the hum of the motel's air conditioner, but they grew louder, more insistent. "Come back, come back." I checked the locks, the windows, even the vents, but the sound was everywhere, seeping through the walls. I tried to drown it out with the TV, but the words cut through, clear as a bell. Around midnight, I heard a new sound, a soft scratching like nails on wood coming from the door. I grabbed the knife I'd kept from the cabin, my pulse racing, and crept toward the sound. The scratching stopped, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing but the empty parking lot. Then the lights flickered. Just once, but it was enough to make me jump. When they came back on, the photo on the nightstand was different. The oak was still there, the carving still glowing, but the figure was closer now. Its long limbs stretched toward the camera, its faceless head filling half the frame. I hadn't touched the photo, hadn't developed a new one. It had changed on its own. I threw it across the room, my hands shaking, but the whispers only laughed, a low, guttural sound that wasn't human. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, knife in hand, watching the door until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. The hollow wasn't going to let me go, not until I faced it. I packed my bag, took the documents and the photo, and got in my car. I wasn't going back to Ashwood, not yet, but I needed to know more. There was one place left to look, the church in Millhaven, where Elias Ward had preached. If his Bible had been found at the oak, maybe he'd left something else behind, something that could tell me how to end this. As I drove, the woods loomed on either side, their shadows stretching across the road like fingers. The whispers followed, softer now, but still there, a constant reminder that the hollow was watching. And in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, I saw it, the pale figure standing at the edge of the trees, its head tilted, waiting. The church in Millhaven was a relic, a squat stone building with a steeple that leaned slightly, as if bowing under the weight of time. Its stained glass windows were dulled by grime, and the iron gate creaked as I pushed it open. The air felt heavy, like the woods had followed me here, their presence lingering in the shadows of the overgrown cemetery out back. I'd come looking for answers, hoping Elias Ward had left something behind, a clue, a warning, anything to help me understand what the keeper wanted and how to escape it. But as I stepped inside, the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, curling around me like smoke. You're here. You're ours. The interior was dim, lit only by slants of light filtering through the windows. Dust motes floated in the air, and the pews were coated in a fine layer of neglect. A faint smell of damp wood and old wax hung in the space. The pastor, a wiry man in his 50s named Reverend Lyle, was sweeping the aisle when I arrived. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took me in. "You're not from around here," he said, more a statement than a question. I told him I was staying in Ashwood, researching local history, and his expression tightened. "Ashwood," he muttered, leaning on his broom. "That place is trouble." I didn't waste time. I told him about Elias Ward, the journal, the oak, and the figure in my photos, though I kept the details vague, not wanting to sound unhinged. I asked if the church had any records from Ward's time, anything that might shed light on the hollow. Reverend Lyle listened in silence, his face unreadable, but when I mentioned the keeper, his grip on the broom tightened. "You've been to the oak," he said quietly. "You've seen it." I nodded, and he sighed, setting the broom aside. "Wait here." He disappeared into a back room and returned with a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were papers, sermons, letters, and a few loose pages in Elias Ward's handwriting. "These were found in the rectory after he vanished," Lyle said. "Nobody's touched them in years. Most folks don't want to know." He handed me the box and stepped back like he didn't want to be near it. I sat in a pew and started reading, my hands unsteady. The papers were a mix of the mundane and the terrifying. Sermons about sin and redemption gave way to frantic notes, written in a scrawl that grew shakier with each page. Elias described the keeper in vivid detail. A tall, pale figure with no face, its limbs bending in ways that defied nature. He wrote of dreams where it spoke to him, promising power, immortality if he'd join the hollow. He refused at first, but the dreams grew worse, the whispers louder, until he couldn't sleep, couldn't think. One page stood out, a sketch of the oak, its carvings rendered in ink, surrounded by words. It sees, it knows, it takes. The final page was a letter, unfinished, addressed to no one. "I went to the oak to end it," Elias wrote. "I thought I could pray it away, burn it, destroy it. But the keeper is not of this world. It is the hollow, and the hollow is it. I am marked, and there is no escape." The letter ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off in a jagged line as if he'd been interrupted. I looked up at Reverend Lyle, who was watching me from the far end of the church. "What happened to him?" I asked. "Nobody knows," Lyle said. "They found his Bible at the oak, covered in those marks. Some say he's still out there, part of the woods now." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "You've seen it, haven't you, the thing in the woods?" I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. He shook his head. "Get out of Ashwood, son, before it's too late." I left the church with the box, promising to return it once I'd made copies. The weight of Elias's words pressed on me, each sentence a confirmation of what I'd feared. The keeper wasn't just a story. It was real, and it had chosen me, just as it had chosen him. I drove back to the motel, the whispers growing louder with every mile. By the time I reached my room, they were a constant drone, words overlapping in a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. "Come back, come back." I spread the papers across the bed, next to the documents from Millhaven's library. The parallels were undeniable. Elias had seen the same figure, heard the same whispers, found the same bones. But there was one detail that chilled me most. In his notes, he mentioned a ritual, a way to appease the keeper. It involved blood, an offering at the oak to buy time or freedom. He'd refused, calling it blasphemy, but I wasn't so sure I had that luxury. The photo of the figure was still on the nightstand, and it had changed again. The oak was gone, and the figure filled the frame, its faceless head so close it seemed to press against the paper. The motel room felt like a trap, its peeling wallpaper and flickering lights closing in as the scratching grew louder. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It was in the walls, under the floor, above the ceiling, a relentless skittering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I clutched the knife, its handle slick with sweat, and stood in the center of the room, turning in slow circles, trying to pinpoint the sound. The whispers wove through it, a low chant that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Come back. You're ours. Come back. The photo on the nightstand was a constant pull, the figure's blank face staring through me, its presence a weight I couldn't shake. I didn't dare look at it again. The way it had changed, first the oak, then the figure growing closer, felt like a countdown, each shift bringing it nearer to me. Instead, I focused on Elias Ward's papers, spread across the bed like a map to my own doom. His notes about the ritual kept drawing my eye. Blood at the oak, an offering to the keeper. He'd called it profane, a surrender to something unholy, but he hadn't escaped. His final words haunted me. I am marked and there is no escape. Was that my fate too, to be swallowed by the hollow, my bones left as another warning? I tried to think rationally. I was a photographer, a man of logic, not some zealot chasing ghosts. But the scratching, the whispers, the figure, they weren't rational. They were real and they were here. I grabbed Elias's sketch of the oak, the one with the carvings, and compared it to my photo. The symbols were identical, down to the way they seemed to twist when I stared too long. I traced them with my finger, feeling a faint buzz like static under my skin. The sensation made me recoil, but it also sparked an idea. If the carvings were the keeper's language, maybe they held the key, not just to appease it, but to fight it. I spent hours poring over the papers, cross-referencing Elias's notes with the Millhaven documents. There were hints of resistance, scattered accounts of people who'd survived the hollow. A trapper in 1870 left an offering, a deer's heart placed at the oak, and walked away unharmed. A woman in 1912, lost for days, claimed she'd carved her own symbols into the tree, a plea for mercy, and was found the next morning, shaken but alive. The details were vague, but they suggested the keeper could be bargained with, or at least stalled. I wasn't ready to bleed for it, not yet, but the idea of carving something, of speaking its language, stuck with me. The scratching stopped around 3 a.m., replaced by a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. I didn't trust it. I checked the door, the windows, the vents. Everything was locked, but the air was wrong, heavy with that same thick stillness I'd felt in the clearing. I sat on the bed, knife in one hand, Elias's sketch in the other, and waited. That's when I heard it, a soft thump like a footstep directly above me. My eyes snapped to the ceiling, tracking the sound as it moved, slow and deliberate, across the room. It wasn't the frantic skittering from before. This was purposeful, like something was pacing, testing the boundaries. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The thump came again, closer to the corner of the room, then stopped. For a moment I thought it was gone, but then the whispers surged, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that filled my skull. You see, you know, you're ours. I dropped the sketch, my hands shaking, and grabbed the photo without thinking. The figure was closer now, its long limbs stretched across the frame, its faceless head tilted as if it were looking directly at me. But it wasn't the figure that made my blood run cold. It was the background. The oak was gone, replaced by the interior of my motel room, the bed, the papers, the flickering light above me. It was here. I bolted to the door, fumbling with the lock, but the knob wouldn't turn. It wasn't stuck. It was like something was holding it from the other side. The whispers turned into laughter, low and guttural, echoing from the walls. I backed away, tripping over the bed, and grabbed my bag. I didn't care about the papers or the photo anymore. I just needed to get out. I ran to the window, tore open the curtains, and froze. Outside in the parking lot stood the figure. Tall, pale, its limbs bent at wrong angles, its head tilted as if studying me. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, a silhouette against the streetlight's glow. I don't know how long I stared at it. Seconds, maybe minutes. Time felt broken, like the world was stuck in a loop. Then it moved, not toward me but sideways, slipping into the shadows with that jerky, unnatural gait. The whispers quieted, but the air didn't lighten. I forced the window open, the cold night air hitting my face, and climbed out, not caring about the drop to the pavement below. My car was still there, untouched, and I got in, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the ignition. I drove, not knowing where, just away from the motel, the figure, the hollow. I ended up in a 24-hour diner, the kind of place that smells like grease and regret. The waitress, a tired woman with a name tag that read Darlene, poured me coffee without asking. I must have looked like hell because she didn't make small talk, just slid a menu my way and left me alone. I sat in a booth by the window, Elias's box of papers beside me, and tried to think. Running wasn't working. The keeper had followed me here, changed my photos, invaded my space. I couldn't keep driving forever, and I couldn't go back to Ashwood, not without a plan. I opened the box, pulling out the sketch again. The carvings stared back, their lines seeming to shift under the diner's fluorescent lights. I remembered the woman from 1912, the one who'd carved her own symbols. Maybe that was the answer, not blood, but a message, a way to speak to the keeper in its own tongue. I didn't know what to carve, but I knew where, the oak. It was the heart of the hollow, the keeper's altar. If I was going to end this, I had to go back. The thought made my stomach twist, but I didn't see another way. I spent the rest of the night in the diner, scribbling notes, trying to decode the carvings from Elias's sketch. They weren't random. There was a pattern, a rhythm to their spirals and angles. I wasn't an expert, but I'd spent enough time with patterns in my photography to recognize intent. The symbols felt alive, like they were waiting to be understood. By dawn, I had a rough idea of what to do. Carve a counter symbol, something to reject the keeper's claim and leave an offering. Not blood, but something personal, something that tied me to the world outside the hollow. I left the diner as the sun rose, the sky a dull gray that matched my mood. My car was still in the lot, but there was something new. A single footprint, childlike but wrong, pressed into the dust on the hood. I didn't look too long. I got in, started the engine, and headed back to Ashwood. The whispers were waiting, soft at first, growing louder with every mile. Come back, come back. The road wound through the woods, the trees leaning closer, their branches scraping the car like fingers. I kept my eyes forward, but in the rearview mirror, I saw it, just for a moment. The figure, loping behind, its faceless head tilted, watching. The road back to Ashwood felt like a descent, each mile pulling me deeper into the hollow's grasp. The whispers were a constant now, a chorus of voices weaving through the hum of the engine, urging me closer. Come back. You're ours. Come back. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as the trees closed in, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the sky. The footprint on my car's hood was burned into my mind, small, wrong, a reminder that the keeper was always one step ahead. I didn't look in the rearview mirror anymore. I knew what I'd see. By the time I reached my cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like grasping hands. The air was thick with the smell of pine and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. The house looked untouched, but the symbols carved into the back door were still there, their jagged lines gleaming faintly in the dusk. I didn't go inside. My bag was slung over my shoulder, packed with Elias's papers, my knife, a flashlight, and a small pocket knife for carving. I'd also brought something personal, a photo of my parents, taken years ago at a family barbecue, the only thing I had left from my old life. If the keeper wanted an offering, it would get one, but on my terms. The woods were waiting. I could feel them, a pulse in the ground, a weight in the air. The path to the oak was familiar now, though it seemed to shift underfoot, the trail twisting in ways I didn't remember. The whispers grew louder as I walked, not just words but emotions. Hunger, anger, anticipation. My flashlight beam cut through the growing dark, catching glints of movement in the underbrush, pale shapes, too quick to follow, darting just beyond my sight. I kept my eyes on the path, clutching the pocket knife, its blade etched with a crude version of the counter symbol I'd sketched in the diner. It wasn't perfect, but it was all I had. The clearing came into view, the oak looming at its center like a dark sentinel. The air was colder here, the ground barren as ever, and the tree's branches seemed to writhe, though there was no wind. The carvings were back, etched deep into the bark, their spirals and lines glowing faintly, as if lit from within. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding, and scanned the shadows. The keeper was here. I could feel it, its presence a pressure against my skin. The road back to Ashwood felt like a descent, each mile pulling me deeper into the hollow's grasp. The whispers were a constant now, a chorus of voices weaving through the hum of the engine, urging me closer. Come back. You're ours. Come back. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as the trees closed in, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the sky. The footprint on my car's hood was burned into my mind, small, wrong, a reminder that the keeper was always one step ahead. I didn't look in the rearview mirror anymore. I knew what I'd see. By the time I reached my cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like grasping hands. The air was thick with the smell of pine and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. The house looked untouched, but the symbols carved into the back door were still there, their jagged lines gleaming faintly in the dusk. I didn't go inside. My bag was slung over my shoulder, packed with Elias's papers, my knife, a flashlight, and a small pocket knife for carving. I'd also brought something personal, a photo of my parents, taken years ago at a family barbecue, the only thing I had left from my old life. If the keeper wanted an offering, it would get one, but on my terms. The woods were waiting. I could feel them, a pulse in the ground, a weight in the air. The path to the oak was familiar now, though it seemed to shift underfoot, the trail twisting in ways I didn't remember. The whispers grew louder as I walked, not just words but emotions. Hunger, anger, anticipation. My flashlight beam cut through the growing dark, catching glints of movement in the underbrush, pale shapes, too quick to follow, darting just beyond my sight. I kept my eyes on the path, clutching the pocket knife, its blade etched with a crude version of the counter symbol I'd sketched in the diner. It wasn't perfect, but it was all I had. The clearing came into view, the oak looming at its center like a dark sentinel. The air was colder here, the ground barren as ever, and the tree's branches seemed to writhe, though there was no wind. The carvings were back, etched deep into the bark, their spirals and lines glowing faintly, as if lit from within. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding, and scanned the shadows. The keeper was here. I could feel it, its presence a pressure against my skin. The whispers were a roar now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the tree itself. You're here. You're ours. Stay. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and stepped into the clearing. The ground felt alive, vibrating under my boots, and the air was so thick I could barely breathe. I pulled the photo of my parents from my bag, my fingers trembling as I held it up, a small anchor to the world I was fighting to return to. This is my offering, I said aloud, my voice shaking but firm. "This is me, not you." I placed the photo at the base of the oak, pressing it into the cold dirt, and drew the pocket knife. The counter symbol, a jagged spiral crossed with a line, meant to reject the keeper's claim, was rough, but I hoped it was enough. I knelt, my hands steadying as I began to carve it into the bark, each stroke deliberate, each cut a defiance. The whispers turned to screams, a sound that wasn't sound but a feeling, a rage that clawed at my mind. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and I saw it. The keeper stepping from the trees, its pale form towering, its faceless head tilted as if puzzled. Its limbs moved in jerks like a marionette, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze heavy and ancient. I kept carving, the knife biting deeper, the symbol taking shape. The keeper didn't move closer, but the ground trembled and the oak's branches creaked, bending toward me like fingers. I finished the symbol, my hands slick with sweat and a faint sting of blood where the knife had nicked my palm. I pressed my bleeding hand to the carving, smearing red across the bark, a final offering, not to appease but to challenge. "I'm not yours," I said, my voice barely a whisper now. The keeper tilted its head further, and for a moment I thought I saw something in its blank face, a flicker like a smile or a snarl. Then it stepped back, melting into the shadows, and the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood, my legs weak, and backed away from the oak. The clearing felt empty now, the air lighter, but I didn't trust it. I turned and ran, the path blurring under my feet, the woods a maze of shadows that no longer moved. When I reached the cabin, I didn't stop. I grabbed my camera, my clothes, everything I could carry, and drove out of Ashwood, the trees receding in my rearview mirror. The whispers didn't follow. The figure didn't appear. But I knew better than to believe I was free. I settled in a new town, far from the hollow, a place where the trees were just trees and the air didn't hum with secrets. I didn't develop the photos from Ashwood. I burned them, watching the flames consume the keeper's faceless stare. But at night, when the wind rattles my windows, I hear it, a faint echo, a single word, "Stay." I don't sleep much anymore. I keep the pocket knife close, its blade still etched with the counter symbol, just in case. The hollow let me go, but I know it's waiting. Somewhere in the heart of those woods, the oak still stands, its carvings glowing, and the keeper watches, patient, eternal, knowing I'll always carry its mark.